Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into the very architecture of modern economic thought, guided by Yanis Varoufakis' Foundations of Economics, a beginner's companion.
And this is a systems analysis that it goes right to the roots.
It certainly does.
The book forces us to address a core systemic question, one that is, I think, often intentionally avoided in the standard textbooks.
Which is?
It's whether modern economic theory, and we're talking specifically about the dominant neoclassical school, is a neutral, objective science that just describes how societies actually function.
You know, like physics describing the planets.
Exactly. Or, and this is the alternative he presents, is it actually a profound exercise in disguising very specific political, philosophical, and ideological assumptions as nothing more than value-free technical necessity?
And that question isn't just academic, is it? It's incredibly urgent.
Oh, completely.
Because these economic models, they're not just abstract theories sitting on university hard drives. They are operational systems. They dictate massive global policy decisions. They mold educational curricula, and they fundamentally frame public discourse all over the world.
And when a model presents itself as describing an inevitable law of nature, a kind of social physics, it immediately, almost by definition, limits the range of possible solutions we're even willing to consider.
For huge societal issues.
Right.
Whether we're talking about spiraling inequality, climate change, or, market stability.
All of it. So we really need to look at the machinery itself. Our mission in this deep dive is not to debate individual economists or to take sides on partisan policies.
Yeah.
Instead, we're going to try and map the intricate interlocking systems of knowledge production, of institutional power, and professional reproduction that ensure the continued dominance of this particular way of thinking, this neoclassical thought system.
Okay, so let's unpack those foundations. Our guide here is Yanis Varoufakis, who is, I think, a fascinating figure. He kind of blends the roles of economist and political theorist.
Mm-hmm. And at the time he wrote this book, Foundations of Economics, which was back in 1998, he was a senior lecturer at Sydney University.
Right, though many people will probably know him from his later, more political roles. But his background is in game theory, which gives him this really unique lens for analyzing systems of conflict and cooperation.
And you can see that lens immediately. He applies it to the discipline of economics itself. The whole book's intent is, I think, crucial to understand from the start.
What was the goal?
It was designed as a direct critical companion for undergraduate students who are wading through the conventional, often really overwhelming curriculum.
He has this great line about it. He observed that traditional texts often treat students not as future critical thinkers, but as what he calls seals in need of training.
Yes, just learning to balance the ball on their nose.
Exactly. Mechanistically learning diagrams without ever questioning what those diagrams are actually built on. His stated goal was to relieve the monotony and austerity of those courses.
And he does it with this really clever three-step structure for every single concept he introduces. It's very systematic.
So what's the first step?
First, he dutifully reviews the standard textbook material, the supply and demand curves, the marginal cost calculations, all the stuff you'd expect.
Okay, so he gives you the basics.
It gives you the basics. But then second, he does something that the conventional texts just skip entirely. He provides a kind of archaeological history of the idea. Where did it come from? What political or social problem was it originally trying to solve?
Which is so important because these ideas don't just appear out of thin air.
They absolutely don't. And then comes the third step, the really subversive part that makes this a systems mapping exercise. He subjects the concept to a radical critique. He asks the central question, should we really believe in all this?
I love that. Review, history, critique.
And by taking that approach, he starts to reveal the philosophical and political commitments that are hidden inside what look like, perfectly neutral equations and technical diagrams.
So his central thesis hits you right from the beginning then. It's forceful. The discipline of economics is not a neutral physics-like science describing some universal human condition.
Not at all. It's not based on eternal truths. Rather, it's a historically contingent philosophical discipline. It's shaped entirely by the political values, the power structures, and the ideological commitments that emerge during a very specific historical transition in society.
And that framing is really essential to hold on to as we get into the mechanics of it all.
It is. And it leads straight to the first great paradox Varoufakis wants us to grapple with.
Yeah.
The puzzlingly recent birth of economics.
Right. If you take the standard textbook definition, that economics is the science of rational choice under conditions of scarcity.
Allocating our scarce productive resources, land, labor, and capital.
Exactly. If that's what it is, you would think this discipline should be as old as civilization itself. I mean, wealth, production, scarcity, these have always been central to human life.
Always. So why? Why did a distinct, mathematized, professionalized discipline of economics, in the way we understand it today, not really emerge until, the 1870s, the 1890s?
Yeah, centuries after physics, chemistry, mathematics, they'd all flourished long before.
The answer, which he argues is actually the best introduction to the subject, is that economics only became necessary when society fundamentally changed its operating system.
What do you mean by operating system?
Well, think about ancient Greece or imperial Rome or feudal France. They certainly needed to understand how to acquire and manage wealth and power, but
No.
they could do that perfectly well without what we would call economic analysis.
Because their systems were governed by what he calls extra-economic forces.
Precisely. You can see this so clearly with the analogies he uses. If you wanted to explain the success of, say, Spanish merchants during the conquest of Latin America, the explanation was pretty straightforward.
Military might.
Military might, royal decree, brute force. It was an extra-economic explanation of how wealth was being accumulated. It was based on raw political and military power.
Okay, so contrast that with today.
Right. Today, if you want to explain the success of, I don't know, a German engineering firm that sells specialized tools on the global market, you can't use military analysis. It's useless.
You'd have to use purely economic concepts.
Purely. You talk about price competitiveness, cost structures, productivity gains, innovation, consumer demand elasticity. The whole system has shifted from visible power structures determining wealth to these kind of hidden market-based mechanisms.
And that systemic shift, the one that made economics necessary as a discipline, was the full-fledged commodification of the factors of production.
That's the core of it. Varoufakis argues that economics only became truly necessary when land, labor, and capital became inputs that were traded freely and competitively in markets. This created not just a society with markets, which of course had existed for millennia,
But a market society. A society where the market is the organizing principle.
yes. Let's break those three factors down because this is so fundamental. Let's start with land.
Okay, in the feudal system, land was everything. It was the foundation of the political hierarchy.
Its value was completely tied up with military service, with lineage, with political status. A feudal lord might rent or sell a parcel of land, sure, but the ultimate transfer was regulated by inheritance laws and political alliances.
It wasn't determined by a market price based on what would generate the most profit.
Not at all. In fact, selling off your inherited land just for profit would often be socially taboo or even legally prohibited. It wasn't just another asset.
But then you have this revolutionary moment in Britain, which Varoufakis really highlights as being crucial for the birth of this market society. We're talking about the enclosure movements.
The infamous enclosures. This is when landowners started forcibly consolidating and fencing off common lands that peasants had used for subsistence for generations.
And they turned them into, what? Highly profitable grazing fields for sheep.
Mostly, yes, driven by the booming wool trade. And in that moment, land was instantly transformed
From a social asset
the foundation of peasant livelihood and political stability.
into a purely economic asset, an input for production whose value now just fluctuated wildly with commodity prices.
And that wasn't just a change in farming technique. It was a political decision by the system to treat land as a commodity.
Which brings us to labor.
The second factor. In medieval society, the toil of peasants or slaves was, it was undeniably exploited. But it wasn't bought at a wage that was determined by a competitive market.
A serf's obligation to their lord was fixed. It was defined by tradition, by the threat of violence, and I guess the possibility of revolt.
Exactly. The distribution of the harvest was fundamentally a political matter. It was determined by the lord's leverage and the power dynamics between the monarchy and the local barons.
So what happens when the land is enclosed?
All those evicted peasants are thrown into the streets. You suddenly have this massive displaced population that has absolutely nothing left to sell.
Except their time, their effort, their ability to work.
Which created this brand new commodity called labor. And the price of this labor was now determined by the sheer desperation of these former peasants competing against each other for any work they could find.
And that sets the stage for everything that follows. Competitive wages, unemployment, the industrial factory system.
It's all there. And the final factor is capital. Tools, machinery, finance.
In feudalism, this was also very different, right? Tools were often made locally, Their allocation was rigidly controlled by guilds.
Yes, and the guilds deliberately restricted innovation and competition. Their goal was to protect their own members, not to maximize output. Capital wasn't mobile. It certainly wasn't being allocated to its best possible use based on a competitive rate of return, the way modern economists just assume it is.
So this shift to capitalism, it wasn't some slow, gradual, natural evolution.
Far from it. It was a violent, disruptive political and social transformation. It concentrated land ownership, and it created this newly available class of wage laborers, and the result was massive social dislocation and suffering. But, and this is the critical point.
There was no single person to blame.
Exactly. No single institution you could point to. History started moving in these unpredictable, seemingly self-governing ways. A sudden drop in the price of wool in London could devastate entire regions, causing mass starvation that no king or lord had actually decided upon.
And since no one could be blamed seriously, as he puts it, since it was the hidden hand of the market.
An intellectual explanation became urgently required. Someone had to make sense of the chaos of this new system.
And that is the birth certificate of economics.
That's it. It arose to explain these seemingly hidden, dark forces of the market. And from its very beginning, the need to explain and, frankly, to justify this newly marketized society meant the discipline carried political assumptions baked right into its core.
Specifically, the idea that these markets were somehow natural and inevitable. Okay, so once this new market system required an explanation, economists needed a foundation to build on. And the first major system Varoufakis dissects is the very foundation of all neoclassical theory, the model of human behavior. He starts with this concept of instrumental rationality.
Yes. And the beauty, but also the danger of this definition lies in its simplicity. Neoclassical economics deliberately sidesteps all the complex philosophical debates about what's moral or what's psychologically true. It defines rationality purely instrumentally.
What does that mean, instrumental?
It means that being rational is simply knowing how to use your means, your resources, your time, your money as efficiently as possible to achieve your predetermined ends, your objectives.
And those ends are just called utility.
Just utility, maximum satisfaction.
Now, that might sound like common sense, but as he points out, it immediately encodes this huge systemic assumption, the existence of Homo economicus.
The economic man, this cool, fastidious agent who is a meticulous computational utility maximizer, always balancing the pros and cons of every single choice with perfect accuracy.
And Varoufakis argues that the logic here isn't the logic of an ethical guide or a responsible citizen.
No, it's strictly the logic of the shopkeeper.
The shopkeeper's logic.
The definition collapses the idea of reasonable or rational entirely into profitable or effective, and it deliberately excludes all other types of human logic, like, for example, being responsible or being sympathetic or acting in a way that aligns with your deeply held values, even if it contradicts maximum personal gain.
That reductionist choice is the first real act of ideological commitment in the model.
It is. So let's trace how this system operates. You can see it move from the mathematical model to its ideological consequences.
Okay, so the model design is this instrumental rationality and utility maximization. It's often demonstrated with something called the equimarginal principle.
Right. And for listeners who aren't economists, this simply means that you as a consumer are always trying to get the absolute most satisfaction out of the last dollar you spend on, say, product X, compared to the satisfaction you'd get from that same dollar spent on product Y.
So you're always adjusting. You keep adjusting your purchases until the marginal or extra benefit of X equals the marginal benefit of Y.
It's a beautifully elegant mathematical concept. It assumes perfect computation on the part of the consumer, but the ideological assumption that's baked right into this model is the absolute sovereignty of individual preferences.
Meaning the economist can't judge what you want.
Exactly. They claim they can only judge how efficiently you go about getting it. And this commitment, it necessitates banning what are called interpersonal utility comparisons.
You can't compare my happiness to your happiness.
We cannot scientifically, objectively state that taxing Jack to give to Jill increases the total amount of happiness or utility in society. It's considered an unscientific, value-based judgment.
And the social outcome of this enforced neutrality, is profoundly political, isn't it?
Oh, it's huge. By refusing to judge preferences, the economist renders all desires as equally rational. This is the critique that Varoufakis really drives home.
He has that incredible example. The desire of a millionaire to burn $1,000 notes at a dinner party just to impress his guests.
Is deemed as rational or irrational as the desire of a third-world mother to feed her starving child.
That's a powerful statement.
It is. The economist escapes the ethical dilemma, but the escape itself is a political act. It elevates the market mechanism, the way the millionaire got his wealth in the first place, as the sole judge of legitimacy. It sidelines any philosophical or moral critique of how resources are distributed, or even the quality of our desires.
But this narrow, instrumental definition of rationality, it doesn't just avoid ethics. Varoufakis argues it actively undermines the very concept of human freedom. This leads to what he calls the utility machine paradox.
This is a great thought experiment. If the sole measure of human flourishing and rationality is the efficient maximization of utility, then the logical optimal state for every single human being
Would be to plug into a machine.
a metaphorical utility machine, yes.
Yeah.
A machine that would bypass all the messiness of real life and just electronically bombard your brain with the maximum possible utility signals. It would permanently satisfy your every programmed desire.
And the crucial question he poses to the student is, would you refuse the machine?
Right. If you would refuse, even if the machine guaranteed perfect safety, no negative side effects, and permanent maximal satisfaction, then that refusal demonstrates something profound.
It shows that your definition of rationality involves caring about something other than just maximizing utility.
It suggests that humans value authenticity or the struggle or the pursuit or just the complexity of being human more than they value the simple, final utility score.
So that refusal is actually the ultimate act of a superior rationality. It reclaims the idea that freedom is more than just satisfying cravings.
And it points out two fundamental flaws in the Homo economicus model. The first is the fluidity of our desires, and the second is our capacity for what he calls creative self-manipulation.
Let's start with the fluidity of desires.
Mm.
The neoclassical model assumes a one-way street.
Hmm.
Your preferences dictate your choices. But human experience isn't like that.
No, it's a two-way loop. Our choices actively shape our future preferences. We often choose to do things we don't currently enjoy because we wish we would.
Like forcing yourself to read a challenging book or listening to a type of music you don't understand yet. You're trying to become a different person.
Exactly. You might say, I do not like jazz music right now, but I wish I did, so I'm going to force myself to listen to it. The simple utility maximizer model is structurally helpless in the face of that kind of choice.
Because you're acting against your current preferences.
We're acting against them to cultivate a richer future self. If the choice you make today contaminates your future preference, the whole static calculation of maximum utility just collapses.
And this ties directly into creative self-manipulation. The classic example he uses is Ulysses from the Odyssey.
Ulysses, who knew that the siren's song would lure him and his ship to their deaths. His rational choice wasn't to try and maximize his immediate utility, which was impossible.
He couldn't hear the song and survive on his own.
Right. So instead, he actively manipulated his future actions by having his crew tie him to the mast and plug their own ears with wax. He constrained his immediate freedom to ensure a higher, long-term objective.
Survival, but with the experience of having heard the song.
Think about the modern parallels. Deleting social media apps from your phone before a big exam, or committing to a strict diet. These are acts of self-restraint where a superior reflective rationality or long-term goals overrides your immediate base cravings for short-term utility.
But the Homo economicus model can't account for that. It just reduces the person to a computational servant of their current immediate preferences. It misses the entire point of human agency and moral development.
So the systemic defect becomes crystal clear. By reducing humanity to a bundle of preferences, the neoclassical model completely mistakes the appropriation of utility for genuine freedom.
The freedom it celebrates, the freedom to choose between one product and another in a competitive market, is perfectly compatible with being, in his words, a happy slave.
A happy slave. He defines that as a creature whose cravings are manufactured and guided entirely by external forces, like sophisticated advertising campaigns, but who is perfectly satisfied because those manufactured cravings are fully met.
So the model can't tell the difference between a genuine, reflective choice and just manufactured contentment.
It can't. As John Stuart Mill argued, a truly free person feels morally free when their habits or their temptations are not their masters. But the economic model, by removing our capacity to even judge the quality or the source of those temptations, turns the individual into a sophisticated computational servant of whatever base instinct or externally manufactured craving happens to be the strongest at that moment.
It fundamentally narrows the scope of what it means to be human and what it means to be free.
And that reductionist instrumental logic we just discussed, the one applied to the consumer, is then applied wholesale to the system of production.
Right. And here, the implications for power and ideology become even more stark, even harder to ignore.
In the standard neoclassical textbook, production it's just flattened into a technical exchange. Labor is treated as a quantifiable commodity, like any other input you might buy.
It's analytically equivalent to a banana or a bolt of cloth or a piece of machinery.
Exactly. Production is simplified into a purely technical function like a recipe that just combines land, labor, and capital to yield output. It's completely divorced from its social or political context.
But Varoufakis insists that selling your labor is profoundly different from selling, say, a car.
Fundamentally different. When you sell a car, the transaction is complete. You hand over the keys, the buyer owns the object, that's it. When you sell your labor, the employer gains a continuous right to direct, to control, and to monitor your activity for the entire duration of the contract.
Which leads to a relationship that is inherently defined by potential coercion and by power dynamics.
It's not just an exchange, it's a political hierarchy that gets established inside the workplace. And yet the model's design rigorously abstracts all of that power away.
So how does it do that? What's the model design here?
The model design relies on mathematical formalism. It uses tools like production functions and these things called isoquants. These are basically curves that mathematically show all the possible technical combinations of inputs, like how much labor combined with how much machinery, that can yield the exact same level of output.
But that math isn't neutral.
It's not benign, no. The ideological assumption that underpins it is that the employer-employee relationship is purely mutually beneficial, it's consensual, and it's analytically symmetrical to any other trade you might make in the market.
It reduces that whole complex social relationship to a simple exchange of labor units for money. It just obscures the transfer of power that's inherent in that hiring contract.
And the powerful social outcome of this mathematical formalism is that it consciously filters politics out of economics by design. Exploitation, coercion, power imbalances in the workplace. They become fundamentally invisible to the economic theorist using these models.
The model implicitly endorses the liberal political view that basically anything an employer can achieve within the existing market rules is acceptable.
Because the market itself is assumed to be fair. It's a closed loop.
You raised a crucial point earlier about why neoclassical economics needs to treat labor like a banana. It's because that equimarginal principle, that balancing act for consumers, it can only be applied to production if all the inputs are, analytically interchangeable units.
Yeah. Exactly. If labor is complex and human and political, you can't use the same neat calculus to determine the optimal mix of inputs that gives you the highest profit. Mathematical unity, in this case, requires ideological sacrifice. You have to sacrifice realism.
And the architects of this school of thought, people like Alfred Marshall and Leon Walras at the end of the 19th century, they were deeply aware of this, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. They wanted to professionalize economics. They needed to free it from the messy political battles that had characterized the work of their predecessors, Adam Smith, Ricardo, Karl Marx. They wanted respectability.
And respectability meant mirroring the hard sciences.
It meant mirroring Newtonian classical mechanics. They had their equivalent of the heavenly bodies, the decision makers. They posited a kind of gravitational constant utility maximization. They described the motion mathematically with the equimarginal principle. They needed this structural rigor to get funding and professional legitimacy over the other, less mathematical social sciences.
This pursuit of scientific neutrality, it led to the invention of this idea of positive economics.
Yes, the objective scientific study of how things are, supposedly free of any political passion or ethical judgment. And they deliberately segregated that from normative economics, which was the realm of moral judgment about how things should be.
But hold on, isn't the pursuit of mathematical rigor and scientific precision a good thing for a discipline? I mean, if economics wants to influence policy, surely it needs to speak the language of hard data and prediction, which often requires complex math. Is it really fair to call this a priesthood if it's just about establishing high standards of technical competence?
That's a really fair challenge, and it gets right to the heart of the critique. Varoufakis isn't saying that math is inherently bad or evil. He's saying that in economics, the choice of which math to prioritize, and more importantly, which assumptions that math requires you to make, is itself an inherently political act.
So the rigor itself becomes the camouflage.
The rigor becomes the camouflage. The moment you define rationality in this narrow, instrumental way, That definition is loaded with political content, regardless of the fancy equation that follows it. The math isn't neutral if the inputs like Homo economicus are themselves ideological constructs.
So the best way to push a political agenda, let's say, arguing for minimal government intervention in the market.
Is to convince everyone that you don't have an agenda at all, that your conclusions are simply the result of objective, neutral mathematics.
And this leads directly to the system's incredible ability to defend itself from criticism.
It's an extraordinary self-defense mechanism. Varoufakis discusses how someone like Milton Friedman argued that economists should only judge a theory by its predictive power, regardless of how unrealistic its assumptions are.
Even if it means modeling humans as computational machines or completely ignoring power dynamics in the workplace.
It doesn't matter, according to that view, as long as the model predicts. But here's where the maneuver comes in. When economic predictions based on these simplistic, mathematically convenient models fail, say, a model predicts low inflation, but you get high inflation.
Which happens.
It happens. The economist has a unique intellectual escape hatch that a physicist just does not have.
What do you mean?
While a physicist can't blame the atoms or the planets for failing to obey the laws of nature, but the economist, when their predictions fail, can always blame the economic agents, the humans, for acting irrationally, or they can blame some exogenous factor outside the model, like a sudden shock of irrational expectations.
Which means the theory itself is often inoculated against being proven wrong. It's unfalsifiable.
If you can always blame the people you're studying every time they deviate from your theory, then the core theoretical assumptions, like utility maximization, are rendered basically untestable. They become immune to empirical critique.
And this intellectual mechanism ensures the survival of these core neoclassical perspectives across decades, regardless of financial crashes or technological revolutions or spiraling inequality.
The most important ideologically committed assumptions are deliberately placed beyond the reach of empirical testing, which preserves the professional status quo.
So if the entire project of economics is supposed to help society manage scarcity and make good choices, what happens when it tries to apply its highly constrained model of instrumental rationality to the most complex challenge of all, making choices for the collective good?
This is the realm of welfare economics, and it represents either the crowning achievement or perhaps the tragic flaw of the entire neoclassical project. It culminates in what are known as the two fundamental theorems of welfare economics.
Okay, what's the first theorem?
The first theorem is the miraculous claim that is taught in every Econ 101 class. It's that competitive markets, if left to reach a long-term equilibrium, are the most wonderful machine for efficiently transforming resources into the maximum possible basket of goods. This is what's known as Pareto efficiency.
And to clarify that for our listeners, a situation is Pareto efficient if it's impossible to make any one person better off without simultaneously making at least one other person worse off.
Exactly. It sounds like a perfect ideal of efficiency, doesn't it?
It does, but it's a very weak moral standard when you think about it.
Incredibly weak. A situation where one person owns 99% of all the wealth and 99% of the people are starving is technically Pareto efficient.
Because taking a single crumb from the rich person to give to a starving person would make the rich person marginally worse off.
And that's forbidden by the definition. Yet the theorem suggests that this horribly unequal outcome is maximally efficient.
So what about the second theorem of welfare economics? What's the policy solution it offers?
This one is incredibly powerful politically. It says that any desired efficient outcome and distribution of wealth can be achieved. All you have to do is select the initial endowment of resources, decide where everyone starts the race, and then let the competitive market run its course.
So the systemic illusion this creates is captivating. It's a message to policymakers.
It is. It tells them markets are inherently miraculous technical mechanisms. The only moral or political choice you need to make is where to set the starting line, how much initial wealth redistribution you want to do. After that, any more intervention is dangerous because the market will find the perfect, efficient outcome all on its own.
It neatly separates the idea of market efficiency from the idea of social justice, and it frames justice as just a one-time adjustment at the beginning.
A one-time fix. But Varoufakis argues this theoretical paradise just collapses immediately when it's confronted with reality. Even if we ignore all the philosophical flaws of Homo economicus, markets inevitably fail. They fail because of inherent coordination problems and institutional failures.
Okay, let's take institutional failure first. What does that mean?
Well, we often deal with things like public goods, like clean air or national defense, things we all enjoy that you can't exclude people from.
Or externalities, like pollution, where the costs are borne by people who aren't part of the transaction.
Right, and asymmetric information. Varoufakis uses the classic secondhand car market problem. If buyers can't instantly tell the quality of a used car, sellers of good cars get driven out of the market, and the market becomes dominated by lemons.
So this failure of information leads to a permanent market inefficiency.
It does. But the more insidious problem is coordination failure, which is often associated with Keynesian uncertainty. And this is a crucial systems concept. The market fails not because people are irrational, but because people predict failure. And that very prediction causes the failure.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Imagine a recession is looming. Firms start to fear that future demand will be low, so they cut back on investment and lay off workers to be safe.
Okay.
But those laid-off workers now have less income to spend, which validates the firm's initial fear of low demand. Everyone acted perfectly rationally based on their individual prediction, but their collective choices resulted in the worst possible outcome for everyone.
So in a coordination game like that, people fail to choose the option that benefits the collective simply because there's a lack of shared trust caused by uncertainty. The market is supposed to solve this, but often it just makes it worse.
Precisely. But the greatest, most devastating challenge to the whole neoclassical project, he calls the third theorem that textbooks took years to acknowledge and often bury in the appendices, is Arrow's impossibility theorem.
And this theorem, he says, mathematically annihilated the hope of constructing a truly rational society.
It did. And it connects directly back to that ideological assumption we talked about earlier, the ban on interpersonal utility comparisons.
Because economists can't scientifically say that my suffering is worse or better than your pleasure.
Right. Because of that ban, any attempt to aggregate all of our individual preferences into a single, coherent, rational social utility function for society to maximize is mathematically doomed to fail.
So the system tracing here is profound. The model design is this attempt to find a single objective social utility function that society can maximize. It's trying to make societal choices technical and instrumentally rational to avoid the messiness of politics.
But the mathematical outcome Arrow's theorem demonstrates that if you demand some very basic democratic criteria for a social choice mechanism,
Like what?
like, for instance, demanding that if everyone prefers X over Y, then society as a whole must prefer X over Y. If you demand that, and you also insist on banning interpersonal utility comparisons, it is mathematically impossible to consistently aggregate all our contradictory individual preferences into a coherent social ranking or choice.
That's devastating. It means that after all the mathematical rigor, all the complex diagrams, and the entire pursuit of physics-like certainty,
Economics cannot tell us what policy or even what configuration of the market actually serves the common good.
the discipline is forced to crash land, as he puts it, right back into the mire of political and philosophical debate, the very place its founders tried to escape from 150 years ago.
Exactly. Decisions about the common good now depend entirely on your pre-existing ideological commitments. Do you favor a Rawlsian social democracy, which prioritizes justice for the least well-off? Or do you favor Nozikian libertarianism, which prioritizes the absolute protection of property rights? Economics, relying on instrumental rationality, has no technical way to decide between them.
So if the theories are so mathematically and philosophically crippled, why do we constantly hear policymakers and economists issuing these incredibly confident recommendations? Privatization, deregulation, austerity, and claiming that they boost social utility.
It's a performative function. They cling to the idea that the rational society is possible, or at least they act as if it is. Varoufakis argues that the neoclassical project often requires the textbook to just pretend the dream goes on. They bury the devastating implications of Arrow's theorem and continue to issue these confident technical policy recommendations, even when the theoretical scaffolding they need to justify them has been mathematically destroyed.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me, and where we move from the critique of the ideas to a critique of the profession itself. If the core theories are philosophically flawed, based on this impoverished view of human nature, and are mathematically incapable of delivering coherent policy prescriptions for society, why does this system persist? Why does it continue to dominate academia, government, and policy debates all over the world?
It persists because it's sustained by an incredibly resilient, interlocking system of professional incentives and institutional feedback loops. Varoufakis maps this out brilliantly. We have to identify the actors, the incentives, and the narratives.
The primary actors seem pretty clear. You've got the academic economists themselves, the institutions they work in, like universities and research centers, the policymakers and business leaders who fund and employ them.
And critically, the students. The
Mm.
students entering the field who then become the next generation of actors in that same system.
So let's start with the incentives. What's the first major incentive?
The first is professional legitimacy. As we already noted, the neoclassical movement strategically modeled its discipline after Newtonian physics, a social physics, to elevate its own status.
And this organizational move, it allowed economics departments to secure vastly superior funding and political access compared to other social sciences.
Absolutely. Compared to sociology or anthropology, which deal with the messy realities of power and culture, economics looked clean, hard, and scientific. It got the money and the influence.
The second, and maybe the most effective incentive, is what you called mathematical rigor. We debated whether this was necessary or just camouflage.
And Varoufakis argues pretty strongly that the complex mathematics acts as an impenetrable self-reinforcing fence. It keeps the critics out. If you're trained in the humanities or other social fields, but you can't navigate the advanced calculus, you can't really criticize the core assumptions in a way that the profession will listen to.
So this mathematical barrier, it requires aspiring economists to dedicate years of pretty painful training just to master the techniques.
And that process acts as a powerful, self-selecting filter. It ensures that those who survive the training are, almost by necessity, already committed to the dominant neoclassical ideology. They're the ones who value the mathematical form over the realism of the content. It's a mechanism for professional compliance and ideological convergence.
And the third major incentive is just pure policy influence.
Right. Governments, large corporations, and generally those who benefit from the existing distribution of power, they strongly prefer the neoclassical narrative.
Of course they do. It promotes the view that the market knows best, that wealth inequality is just the efficient outcome of rational choices, and that government intervention usually just leads to inefficiency, distortion, and inflation.
This narrative provides the scientific ideology of liberal capitalism. In previous eras, rulers might have used religious doctrine or divine right to legitimize their power and justify social outcomes.
But today, they use economics.
Today, they use economics. Rulers who once used sin as the enemy to fight now use economic inefficiency. And they hide these webs of vested interests behind complex, seemingly objective technical language.
And this dominance is sustained by this powerful feedback loop in education.
A huge feedback loop. The textbooks, often massive and incredibly expensive, are written almost entirely within this neoclassical framework. They just filter out the history, the philosophical controversy, and the critiques, including the kind of critiques found in Varoufakis' own book.
So they create the illusion of a single objective truth.
Exactly. Students are taught to emulate mechanistically. They learn to solve the equations, but not to question the premises. And if the premises are fixed, then the outcomes are presented as inevitable. This system of ideological reproduction ensures that the supply of neoclassical thinkers is constantly replenishing the universities and the policy think tanks that reinforce the political structure.
And Varoufakis suggests that just being exposed to this reductionist worldview, this constant reinforcement of Homo economicus as the model of the rational person, can actually be detrimental to a student's own character.
He calls it the curse of economics education. When students are only ever taught that true rationality is synonymous with this narrow, instrumental utility maximization, they might start to internalize the belief that if they occasionally act with responsibility or sympathy or moral concern, that contradicts their maximum personal gain.
That they're acting irrationally, that they're somehow less than fully functional.
They lose the ability to judge or creatively manipulate their own desires, precisely the capacity we identified earlier as being essential to genuine freedom.
He uses this powerful priesthood metaphor to describe the economics profession.
It's a great metaphor. He says its continued success isn't based on scientific validation, since the core theories are immune to being falsified, but on its capacity to offer full internal explanations for its own failures.
Usually by blaming irrational actors or random external shocks.
Like any priesthood, it maintains a monopoly on economic wisdom. The complex math, the esoteric language, the exclusive journals, they serve as the temple walls. And young, ambitious economists know they have to join this priesthood if they want to secure funding, get published, and have a successful career.
So if a bright, critical student rejects the neoclassical models from the start, they face being branded and eccentric or being isolated and basically losing access to the entire career track.
It becomes a completely circular argument. The professional and political success of the priesthood, its ability to attract funding and influence government, is what convinces the next generation of students that this is the path to power.
So they join, they reinforce the models, and the dominance just perpetuates itself, regardless of whether the models actually describe the real economy or not.
The persistence is entirely political. By claiming to be objective, mathematized, and apolitical, neoclassical economics provides the perfect intellectual defense for the status quo. It shifts the burden of proof from the system to the individual, and it ensures that the existing market framework remains untouched by any kind of deep, systemic critique.
So Varoufakis really forces us to step back and ask, what is this discipline, really? We've analyzed its historical necessity, the impoverished view of humanity it requires, and the institutional incentives that keep it going. So what does this deep dive mean for us and for the whole project of crisis in perception?
I think first we have to recognize that economic theory is a hybrid. It's a blend of technical science, insofar as it does describe certain processes and profound political ideology.
It's not one or the other.
It's both. It is deeply bound up with the history and the political conflicts of the society it emerged from. It's not an eternal, universal description of human affairs. It's a human construct, and it's contingent on a very specific type of society, a market society existing.
Second, the accepted definition of rationality as just the efficient satisfaction of your existing preferences, this instrumental rationality, it's tragically narrow. You could even argue it's anti-human.
It is. We are reminded that true freedom and moral integrity, they require the capacity to evaluate, to critique, and to transform one's own desires. And that is something that Homo economicus is specifically prevented from doing by its very definition.
And third, and this is probably the most crucial point about knowledge, power, and legitimacy.
Yeah.
Economic theory today is perhaps the primary political weapon used by those in power.
Absolutely. It's used to justify interventions like massive bailouts for banks, or maybe more often non-interventions like deregulation, all on the grounds of technical necessity.
So behind the complex, objective-sounding language of efficiency and market correction and Pareto optimality, there lies this web of vested interests and political preferences.
And the technical complexity serves to dress up those interests. It keeps the general public in the dark, and it effectively impedes democratic participation in shaping the foundational rules of our society.
And this perspective links directly back to the core themes of crisis in perception. It shows how systems, in this case systems of economic thought, are used to shift the blame from structural failures to individual failings.
Irrational consumers, bad incentives.
Right. It demonstrates how high-level expertise can be used to conceal ideology, making what is fundamentally a political dilemma sound like it's just a mere technical calculation.
And because of this sustained professionalization and this political utility, what we call common sense economics, the idea that markets are natural, efficient, and self-correcting, it feels completely inevitable. It feels like gravity. Varoufakis' work is like an instruction manual on how to see past that perceived inevitability.
His final reflection, I think, serves as the ultimate provocation for any student or any citizen who's engaging with economics today.
Which is that the goal of studying this discipline isn't necessarily to learn a set of technical truths, but to learn how not to be deceived by economists.
That's a powerful thought.
It is. By critically studying the dominant economic mythology of our age, even if we believe it contains very little truth about the actual economy, we equip ourselves to resist the deceptions of those who employ that mythology to maintain power.
So the choice of which economic theory to believe is, in the end, the choice of which human story we believe. We're left with the realization that the battles between competing economic perspectives, neoclassicism, Keynesianism, Marxism, libertarianism, these aren't just technical debates.
No, they are highly political, philosophical, and ideological contests, and they echo these ancient skirmishes about human nature and what constitutes a good life. These contests will continue as long as there is more than one perception of what it means to be human.
We've been diving into the systems-level analysis presented in Foundations of Economics, A Beginner's Companion by Yanis Varoufakis. We highly encourage you to read the book or borrow it from a library.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.